After 40 years of marriage, she lost her home, until a locked shed revealed the truth no one told her. The house still smelled like coffee when they told her it wasn't hers. Not the walls she painted, not the floor she walked every morning. 40 years, reduced to paperwork she had never seen. That night, alone in a borrowed room, she found a small brass key tied with thread, something her mother once hid. By morning, she was driving toward a place she had been told to forget. What would you do if everything you believed about your life suddenly didn't add up? Ruth Delaney woke before the alarm, the way she always did. The house was still dark, quiet in that particular way that only comes just before morning, when even the refrigerator seems to hum softer, as if it's waiting for the day to begin. She lay there for a moment, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan, counting its slow turns, not because she needed to, but because it was something she had done for years without thinking. Then she swung her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold. It always was. Ruth didn't rush. She never had. She slipped on her slippers, tied the belt of her robe, and moved down the hallway, her hand brushing lightly against the wall where the paint had worn smooth over time. She knew every inch of this house that way, not by sight, but by touch. The kitchen light clicked on with a soft snap. Same yellow glow, same worn linoleum floor, same coffee maker that had been replaced twice but always sat in the same spot, just left of the sink. She filled it halfway, just like Leonard liked, not too strong. He used to say strong coffee made a man impatient. Ruth didn't know if that was true, but she had followed it anyway. Steam began to rise, slow and steady. She stood there watching it for a second longer than necessary, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. Outside, beyond the back window, the outline of the old auto parts factory stretched across the horizon. Dark. Empty. It had been closed for nearly 15 years now, but the building still stood like it was waiting for someone to come back and turn the lights on. No one ever did. Ruth turned away from the window and reached for 2 mugs out of habit. She stopped halfway. Her fingers hovered in the air. Then she took just one. She didn't think about it. Not really. She just adjusted. That was something she had always been good at. Adjusting. By the time the sun started to come up, Ruth was already outside. The backyard was small but neat, grass trimmed. The same line where she had hung laundry for decades stretched between 2 wooden posts, the rope replaced more than once but always tied the same way. She clipped a sheet in place, smoothing it with her palms. The air smelled faintly of metal and damp earth. It always did this close to the factory. A train horn sounded somewhere far off. Ruth paused, one clothespin between her fingers, and looked across the yard. The fence leaned slightly on the far side. It had for years. Leonard used to say he'd fix it when he had time. He never got around to it. She could have fixed it herself. She knew that now. But back then, she had waited. Waited for the right time. Waited for him to say yes. Waited for things to line up the way they were supposed to. Ruth finished hanging the laundry and stepped back. Everything looked the same as it always had. The house, the yard, the quiet stretch of land between her and the empty factory. It all felt settled. Like something that had already decided what it was going to be. Inside, the clock above the stove read 6:42. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved through the house, straightening small things that didn't need straightening. A chair pushed in slightly. A magazine aligned with the edge of the table. The remote placed exactly where Leonard preferred it, even though he hadn't watched television in weeks. It wasn't about him being there. It was about things being right. Ruth moved into the hallway and stopped in front of a narrow wooden cabinet built into the wall, the one where they kept important papers. Or rather, where Leonard kept them. She opened it halfway. Inside were folders, envelopes, stacks of documents held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. Ruth looked at them the way she might look at something in a store window. Familiar, but not hers to touch. She had never gone through them. Not because she wasn't allowed. Leonard had never said that. He just said, "I've got it covered," and that had been enough. It had always been enough. Ruth closed the cabinet gently. The latch clicked into place with a quiet, final sound. She stood there a moment longer than she meant to. Something about the way the papers sat inside, neat, organized, untouched, felt distant, like a room in a house you live in but never enter. She turned away. The house shifted around her in small, familiar noises, pipes settling, floorboards creaking softly under her weight. Everything where it should be, everything exactly the same. And yet, there were things she had never asked. Not about the house, not about the bills, not about whose name was written on the documents tucked behind that cabinet door. It hadn't felt important. Not when the mortgage was paid. Not when the lights stayed on. Not when dinner was on the table every night at 6, and Leonard sat across from her like he always had, reading the paper, nodding at things he never explained. Ruth walked back into the kitchen and poured her coffee. She took a sip. Still too hot. She set the mug down and looked out the window again. The sun had come up now, casting a pale light across the yard. The laundry moved slightly in the breeze, slow and steady. The factory beyond it stood silent, unmoving. For a long time, Ruth stood there, watching the light change. The house behind her, the yard in front of her, the life she had lived for 40 years. It all felt solid, certain, like something built carefully, piece by piece, something shared, something hers. But there was a small space in that certainty now, not large enough to name, not loud enough to demand attention. Just there, like a thought that hadn't finished forming. Ruth picked up her coffee again, took another sip, and went on with her morning. The way she always did, as if everything in this house belonged exactly where it was. As if she did too. The call came just after 9. Ruth was rinsing a plate at the sink when the phone rang from the living room. The sound cut through the quiet, sharp, and unfamiliar. She dried her hands slowly on the same dish towel, then walked in, her slippers soft against the floor. She didn't recognize the number. "Hello?" A man's voice answered. Polite, measured, not someone she knew. "Mrs. Delaney? This is Victor Hale. I'm calling on behalf of your husband's estate. We'd like you to come in this afternoon. There are a few things we need to go over." Estate. The word sat there. Ruth glanced toward the recliner by the window, Leonard's chair, the newspaper still folded on the arm where he'd left it last week. "What kind of things?" she asked. "Just paperwork," the man said. "It won't take long." Paperwork. Ruth nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "All right," she said. They gave her an address, an office downtown, above a bank she had passed 100 times and never entered. After she hung up, the house felt different. Not louder, not colder, just off. Ruth stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if something might explain itself if she waited long enough. Nothing did. The drive into town took 20 minutes. The closer she got, the tighter everything felt. Buildings closer together, traffic lights too close, people moving faster than she remembered. She parked along the curb and sat for a moment, her hands still resting on the steering wheel. Then she stepped out. The office was on the second floor. The stairs smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and something older underneath it. At the top, a glass door with black lettering. Hale and Branson Legal Services. Ruth hesitated just long enough to notice her reflection in the glass. Then she opened the door. Inside, the air was cool and still. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled politely. "Mrs. Delaney, they're expecting you." Ruth nodded. They led her down a narrow hallway into a small conference room. Two men were already seated. One of them stood when she entered. Victor Hale, mid-50s, gray suit, the kind of man who looked like he spoke carefully even when he didn't have to. The other man stayed seated. Ruth recognized him after a second. Daniel. Leonard's nephew. He had been around over the years, holidays, occasional visits, always polite, always just passing through. Now he sat at the table with a folder in front of him, his hands resting flat on either side of it. "Ruth," he said, standing halfway, then sitting again as if unsure what the right movement was. She took the chair across from them. The table felt too large for the room. Victor cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Delaney, first let me say we're very sorry for your loss." Ruth nodded. She had heard that sentence so many times in the past week that it no longer felt connected to anything real. Victor opened the folder. "There are some matters regarding Leonard's estate that we need to review with you." Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "All right." He slid a document across the table. It was several pages, typed, official-looking. "Leonard updated his will 3 years ago," Victor said. Ruth's eyes moved slowly across the first page. The words didn't come together right away. She saw names, dates, legal phrases she didn't fully understand. Then one line caught. "Primary assets to be held under Delaney Industrial Trust." Ruth looked up. "What does that mean?" she asked. Victor didn't hesitate. "It means that the house, the business property, and associated financial accounts are part of a trust structure Leonard established." Ruth blinked. "A trust?" she said. Daniel shifted in his seat. "It's just a way of managing things," he added quickly. "It's more efficient." Ruth looked back down at the paper. Her name was there, but not where she expected it. Not listed as owner, not listed as beneficiary in the way she thought it would be. It appeared once, in a paragraph about personal effects. Items of sentimental value to be distributed at the discretion of the trustee. Ruth's fingers tightened slightly. "Who's the trustee?" she asked. There was a pause. Daniel answered, "I am." The room went quiet. Ruth looked at him. Really looked. He didn't look away, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like someone bracing for something they couldn't quite name. "And the house?" Ruth asked. Victor folded his hands neatly on the table. "The property is part of the trust," he said. "It will be listed for sale." Ruth stared at him. "For sale?" she repeated. "Yes," Victor said. "Given the current market conditions, it's the most practical course of action." Practical. The word felt thin, like it didn't quite reach the weight of what it was describing. Ruth looked down at the document again. Her eyes moved more carefully this time. She saw dates. 3 years ago. 3 years. Leonard had signed this 3 years ago. At the same kitchen table where she had poured his coffee every morning. At the same counter where she had stood just hours ago. She turned a page. There were signatures. His. Witnessed. Notarized. Everything in order. Everything decided. "And I?" Ruth said quietly. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "We'll make sure you're taken care of," he said. "Of course. There are arrangements, temporary housing, some funds set aside." Ruth didn't respond right away. She looked at the paper again, then at the 2 men across from her, then back at the paper. It didn't feel like anger. Not yet. It felt like trying to understand something that refused to line up, like reading a sentence where the words were all correct, but the meaning was wrong. "I lived there for 40 years, she said. Her voice was steady. No one interrupted. "I painted those walls," she continued. "I fixed the sink when it broke. I paid the electric bill when it came in the mail." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. Victor spoke instead. "We understand this is difficult," he said, "but legally, the structure is very clear." Legally. Clear. Ruth let the words settle. She looked down at her hands. They were still folded in her lap. Still. The way they had always been when Leonard handled things. She had never asked to see the papers, never asked whose name was on what. Because he said he had it covered. And she had believed him. Ruth reached out and touched the edge of the document. The paper was smooth, cool, real. Outside the window, a car passed, the faint sound of tires on pavement. Inside, nothing moved. "I see," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just sat there, looking at a life that had been written down in a way she had never been shown. And for the first time, the house she had left that morning, the one with the worn floors and the leaning fence and the coffee maker in the same place, didn't feel as certain as it had a few hours before. It felt conditional. Like something that had always been held together by paperwork she had never read. Victor gathered the documents neatly. "We'll give you some time," he said, "but there are timelines we need to follow." Timelines. Ruth nodded again. Because that was what she did. She adjusted. Even now. But as she stood and followed them out of the room, something small had shifted. Not enough to name, not enough to act on, just enough to notice. The space in that certainty from this morning, it had gotten a little wider. Ruth felt it all the way home. The drive back from the office passed in a blur of traffic lights and familiar corners that no longer felt quite as familiar. She stopped at the same intersection she had crossed for years, but for a moment, she couldn't remember which way the light usually turned first. She waited anyway. The house came into view just past the old factory, the same as it always had. Low roof, faded siding, the porch steps slightly uneven where one board had warped years ago. Nothing had changed. And yet, when she pulled into the driveway, there was a car she didn't recognize. A dark sedan, clean, parked just slightly too close to the garage. Ruth sat in her car for a moment, her hands resting on the wheel again, the engine still running. Then Hawes turned it off. The quiet settled in. She stepped out slowly, closing the door behind her with more care than usual. As she walked up the path, she noticed the front door was open. Not wide, just enough. Inside, voices, low, businesslike. Ruth paused on the threshold. "Hello?" she called. The voices stopped. A man stepped into view from the hallway, mid-30s, clipboard in hand. "Oh, sorry," he said. "You must be Mrs. Delaney." Ruth looked past him. Another man stood in the living room, measuring tape stretched from one wall to the other. "What is this?" she asked. The first man glanced down at his clipboard, then back up. "We're doing a preliminary walkthrough. Property assessment." Ruth didn't move. No one had told her they were coming. She stepped inside anyway. The air felt disturbed, like a room that had been opened too long. The man in the living room called out a number. The one with the clipboard wrote it down. Ruth stood there, watching them. They moved through the house with quiet efficiency. Kitchen, hallway, bedroom, opening doors, looking into spaces she had never seen as separate from herself. Now they were. Measured, noted, reduced. Ruth followed them into the kitchen. One of them opened a cabinet, closed it again. "Plumbing looks older," he said casually. Ruth stared at the cabinet. She had replaced the hinges on that door herself, sanded the edges when it wouldn't close right. He hadn't noticed. He just marked something on his paper. "Is this necessary?" Ruth asked. The man with the clipboard gave a small, practiced smile. "Standard process," he said. "Nothing to worry about." "Nothing to worry about." Ruth nodded, because that was what she did. She watched them finish. They thanked her, or maybe they didn't. She wasn't sure. They left the door open behind them. Ruth closed it. The click of the latch echoed a little louder than it should have. The boxes arrived the next morning. Not all at once, just a few at first, stacked neatly on the front porch. No note, no explanation. Ruth opened the door and looked at them. Brown cardboard, tape across the top, labels printed in black marker. Kitchen, books, bedroom. Her handwriting wasn't on any of them. She bent down and lifted one, lighter than she expected. Inside were dishes. Her dishes. Wrapped in newspaper she didn't recognize. Ruth set the box down carefully and looked around the porch. More boxes sat near the steps, some already sealed, some half open. She hadn't packed them, someone else had. Inside her house. At some point between yesterday afternoon and now. Ruth walked back inside. The living room looked the same, but when she moved closer, things were missing. A lamp from the corner table, the small rug near the door. Even the stack of magazines had been moved. Not taken. Just rearranged. Like someone had begun taking the house apart in pieces. Ruth stood very still. Then she turned and walked down the hallway. The cabinet door was open. The one with the papers. The folders inside were no longer stacked the same way. A few were missing. Ruth reached out and touched the edge of the shelf. It felt colder than usual. She closed the door. This time, the latch didn't catch right away. She pressed it again. Harder. It clicked. 3 days later, Daniel came by. He knocked, but not like a guest, like someone who expected the door to open. Ruth did. He stood there in the same coat, hands in his pockets. "We should talk," he said. Ruth stepped aside. He walked in, glanced around the room, taking in the boxes, the small changes, the spaces where things had been. "We're moving forward with the listing," he said. There's interest already. Ruth didn't answer. She waited. There's a timeline, he continued. We'll need the house cleared within the week. Within the week. The words didn't land right away. Ruth looked at him. A week? She said. Daniel nodded. We'll help coordinate everything. Storage, temporary housing, whatever you need. Ruth let out a small breath. Not a sigh. Just air. She looked around the room. At the walls she had painted, the couch she had chosen, the window where she had stood just that morning. All of it suddenly felt temporary, like she had been living in something borrowed without realizing it. I don't have anywhere to go, she said. Daniel shifted slightly. We've arranged something, he said. There's a unit downtown, short term. It's already set up. Arranged. The word echoed faintly. Ruth nodded. Because that was what she did. The next few days passed in quiet motion. Ruth packed what she could. Not everything. Just what fit: clothes, a few books, her mug. Things that felt like they belonged to her. The rest she left. Because she wasn't sure what she was allowed to take, or what would be taken anyway. On the final morning, she stood in the doorway one last time. The house behind her, the yard in front. The laundry line still stretched between the posts. Empty now. The wind moved it slightly. Ruth turned the key in the lock. She hesitated, then pulled it out, and left it on the small table by the door. It didn't feel like hers to keep. The unit above the hardware store was smaller than she expected. One room. A narrow window that looked out onto the street below. The smell of oil and dust hung in the air, settled deep into the walls. Ruth carried her suitcase up the stairs herself, set it on the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under the weight. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Listening. Cars passing. A door slamming somewhere downstairs. Voices she didn't recognize. Nothing familiar. Ruth opened her suitcase, slowly. She unpacked one item at a time, folded clothes into the small dresser, placed her mug on the counter, set her shoes by the wall. Then, near the bottom, something caught her eye. A small piece of metal, tied with faded thread. Ruth frowned slightly. She reached in and picked it up. A brass key. Old. Worn smooth along the edges. She turned it in her fingers. The thread was frayed, but still tied in the same careful knot she remembered. Her mother's knot. Ruth stood there, holding it, trying to remember when she had packed it. She couldn't. She didn't remember seeing it in years. And yet, here it was, in her hand, as if it had been waiting. Ruth looked at the key again, then at the room around her, then back at the key. For the first time since leaving the house, something didn't feel taken. It felt found. Ruth stood there a long time with the key in her hand. The room around her didn't change. The faint hum of traffic below, the smell of oil soaked into the floorboards, the narrow window letting in a thin line of afternoon light. But the feeling, that was new. She turned the key slowly between her fingers. It was heavier than it looked. Not polished, not decorative, just used. The kind of object that had been handled often, then forgotten, then handled again years later. The thread tied around the top was faded, almost gray now, but the knot held firm, tight, intentional. Her mother had tied it that way. Ruth knew it without thinking. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping beneath her weight. The key rested in her palm, warm now from her skin. She tried to remember the last time she had seen it. Not here. Not recently. Somewhere further back. A different house, a different kitchen, a drawer that stuck when you pulled it open too fast. Her mother standing at the counter, turning something over in her hands, just like this. Ruth closed her eyes. And for a moment, the smell of the room shifted. Less oil, more wood. Less dust, more earth. Preble County. The old place. The memory didn't come all at once. It never did. It arrived in pieces. Her mother standing at the back door, looking out toward the field. The wind moving through tall grass. A small building off to the side, wooden, slightly crooked. The shed, Ruth murmured quietly. She opened her eyes. The word settled into the room like it had been waiting. The back shed. She hadn't thought about it in years, not because it wasn't there, but because it had always been off limits in a quiet kind of way. No locked door that she could remember, no warning that sounded like a rule, just something her mother said once and then never explained. Don't worry about what's back there, Ruth. Not sharp, not strict, just final. Ruth had been young then, old enough to notice, not old enough to question. And later, when she had mentioned it to Leonard, years into their marriage, he had said the same thing. Almost the same words. There's nothing out there worth messing with. He hadn't looked at her when he said it. Ruth hadn't pressed. She rarely did. But now, sitting in a room that wasn't hers, holding a key she didn't remember packing, that memory didn't sit the same way anymore. It didn't feel casual. It felt placed. Ruth stood up. The movement came without decision. She walked to the small dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside, her things were folded neatly, exactly the way she always kept them. Order in a space that didn't belong to her. She set the key down, then picked it back up again. No. She wasn't ready to set it aside. She crossed to the window instead. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb. A man carried boxes into the hardware store below, the door opening and closing with a dull, steady rhythm. Normal. Routine. Ruth watched him for a moment. Then she looked back at the key. There was something about the way it had shown up, not in a box, not in a drawer, but in her suitcase. Among the few things she had chosen to bring. Except, she hadn't chosen it. That thought settled quietly. Not alarming. Just clear. Ruth walked back to the bed and opened her suitcase again. She went through it slowly this time, not looking for anything specific, just checking. Her clothes, her mug. The small photo she had tucked between two shirts. Everything was where she remembered placing it. Except the key. There was no place it should have been. No moment she could point to and say, "That's when I packed it." Ruth closed the suitcase, sat back down, and let the silence stretch. Outside, the light had shifted slightly. Late afternoon now, shadows longer across the street. Time had passed. She hadn't noticed. Ruth looked down at the key again. Her thumb traced the edge of it, feeling the worn grooves. Then she turned it over. There was something etched near the base. Not a number, Not exactly a letter, more like a pattern, simple, familiar. Her breath caught, just slightly. She had seen that before, not on paper, not in a book, on wood, on the side of the shed door, a small carved mark near the hinge, something her mother had scratched in years ago, maybe to test a knife, maybe to mark the spot. Ruth had asked about it once. Her mother had smiled, said it didn't mean anything. Ruth had believed her. She didn't believe it now. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, not physically, but in the way a place feels when it can't hold what you're thinking anymore. Ruth stood again. This time she didn't pause. She walked to the sink, turned on the water, and let it run over her hands. Cold, clear, grounding. She dried them slowly, then reached for her purse. The key slipped inside, the thread catching briefly on the edge before settling. Ruth zipped it closed. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do next, but for the first time since she left the house, she wasn't just reacting. She was considering. The thought of the shed stayed with her, not loud, not urgent, just steady, like something that had been waiting its turn. Ruth turned off the light and stepped toward the door. The hallway outside was dim, quiet. She locked the door behind her this time, kept the key, held onto it. As she walked down the stairs, the sounds of the hardware store drifted up, voices, movement, the clink of metal against metal. Life continuing. Normal. But Ruth felt it clearly now. Something had shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to make her look back at things she had never questioned. Enough to make her wonder why certain doors had always stayed closed, and whether they had ever really been meant to stay that way. Ruth didn't sleep much that night. The room above the hardware store held heat differently than her old house. It settled in corners, stayed too long. The sounds from the street below rose and fell. Late trucks, a door slamming, someone laughing too loudly, and then fading away. She lay on her side, facing the wall. The key rested on the small table beside the bed. She had taken it out of her purse without thinking. Set it there. Within reach. Every time she closed her eyes, the same image came back. The shed. Not clearly, just the outline of it, crooked, weathered, sitting off to the side like it had always been waiting for something no one had bothered to ask about. By morning, Ruth was already awake. The light through the window was pale, thin. She didn't linger. Coffee from the diner on the corner, too strong, too hot. She drank half of it anyway, standing at the counter while a radio played softly behind the register. No one asked where she was going. No one needed to. Ruth stepped back out into the cool air and walked to her car. The engine turned over slower than usual. She waited. Then it caught. The drive out of Dayton felt longer than she remembered. Not because the distance had changed, but because she was paying attention now. The buildings gave way slowly. Concrete softened into gravel. Traffic thinned until it disappeared altogether. The road narrowed. Fields stretched out on either side, patches of brown and green, early signs of the season turning. Ruth kept both hands on the wheel. She didn't turn on the radio, didn't fill the silence. There was something about the quiet that felt necessary. Preble County came into view almost without announcement. A small sign near the road, faded lettering, half hidden by brush. She passed it, kept driving. The turns came back to her without effort, left at the leaning mailbox, right where the pavement cracked and shifted. then onto the narrow gravel road she hadn't driven in years. The tires crunched beneath her. Dust lifted behind the car in a slow, steady trail. Ruth slowed as she approached the property, or what had been the property. She didn't stop right away. She drove past it once, just to see. The farmhouse was gone, completely. Where it had stood, white siding, 2 windows facing the road, the porch that always creaked on the 3rd step, there was nothing now but a flat stretch of earth. Grass had taken over, uneven, wild. The outline of the foundation was barely visible. Ruth felt something tighten in her chest. Not sharp, just final. She pulled the car over, turned off the engine. The silence that followed was different from the one in town. Wider, deeper. The kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just undisturbed. Ruth stepped out. The air smelled like dirt and something faintly sweet, like old leaves breaking down beneath the surface. She stood there a moment, then started walking. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, soft in places. The wind moved lightly across the field, brushing against her coat, lifting her hair just enough to remind her it was there. She walked to where the house had been, stopped, looked down. Nothing left. No door, no windows, no walls to recognize, just space. Ruth let her eyes move past it, toward the back of the property. And there, still standing, was the shed. It looked smaller than she remembered, but it was there. Tilted slightly to one side. The wood faded to a dull gray, edges rough where time had worn them down. The roof sagged just enough to suggest it had been holding its breath for years, but it hadn't collapsed. Not yet. Ruth didn't walk straight to it. She moved slowly, circling wide, the way she might have approached something she didn't fully understand. The grass grew thicker here, brush along the edges. She stepped carefully, watching where she placed her feet. As she came around the side, she noticed the first thing. The hinges. They weren't original. The metal was newer, less rust, slightly brighter where it caught the light. Ruth paused, reached out, ran her fingers lightly along the edge. Someone had replaced them. Not recently, but not decades ago either. She moved along the wall. Another detail. A patch of wood. Different grain, different color. Nailed in place where a board had once split. Ruth stepped back, looked at the whole structure. It wasn't abandoned. Not completely. It had been maintained. Quietly, without attention. She walked to the front. The door faced west, just like she remembered. Closed tight. A lock fixed at the center. Rusted, but solid. Ruth stood there, looking at it. The key in her purse felt heavier now. Not physically, but in the way something feels when it starts to make sense. She didn't reach for it yet. Instead, she looked closer. The surface of the door held marks, small scratches, worn lines where hands had pushed or pulled over the years. And there, near the hinge, a shallow carving. Faint, but still there. The same pattern she had traced earlier with her thumb. Ruth exhaled slowly. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. She opened her purse. Carefully. Took the key out. Held it up. The shape matched. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to make her hand steady. Ruth stepped closer. The ground beneath the door was packed down harder than the rest of the yard. Less overgrown. As if someone had stood here before. More than once. She noticed that. stored it away. Then she brought the key to the lock. Paused. Just for a moment. Not from fear, not from hesitation, but from the quiet weight of knowing, once it turned, whatever was inside wouldn't be something she could ignore. The wind shifted behind her, a low sound through the grass. Ruth inserted the key. It slid in smoothly. Too smoothly, for something that had been sitting untouched for years. Her fingers tightened slightly. Then she turned it. The lock resisted. At first, a faint grinding sound, metal against metal. Ruth held steady, applied a little more pressure. The resistance gave. Not all at once, but enough. A dull click, the kind that doesn't echo, but settles. Ruth let her hand rest there, on the handle. The door still closed. She didn't open it. Not yet. She stood there instead, listening to the wind, to the quiet, to the space around her that had held this place together long enough for her to return. Then, slowly, she wrapped her fingers around the edge of the door and began to pull. The wood resisted at first, not from weight, but from time. The bottom edge dragged slightly against the packed earth, a dry, scraping sound that broke the stillness. Dust loosened along the frame, lifting into the air in thin, slow lines. Ruth pulled a little harder. The door gave. A narrow opening. Cool air slipped out from inside, brushing against her face. It smelled different from the outside. Less damp, less wild. Drier. Controlled. Ruth paused there, the door half open, letting her eyes adjust. Then she stepped inside. The light filtered through cracks in the wood, thin beams cutting across the space. It wasn't dark, not completely, just dim enough that everything felt softened, edges blurred by time. Ruth stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. No animals, no movement, just the quiet hum of a place that had been closed long enough to settle into itself. She took a step forward, then another. The floor beneath her was solid, wooden boards, worn but intact. No rot, no collapse. Someone had taken care of this place. That thought landed quietly. Ruth let her eyes move slowly across the room. It wasn't what she expected. Not piles of junk, not broken tools left to rust. Everything was arranged. Shelves lined one wall, boxes stacked neatly, each one labeled in careful handwriting she recognized immediately. Her mother's. The same steady script she had seen on grocery lists, on birthday cards, on notes tucked into drawers. Ruth stepped closer. Garden tools hung in order, clean, oiled. Jars sealed tight along a shelf, their contents faded but preserved. Nothing random, nothing abandoned. It didn't feel like a place that had been forgotten. It felt like a place that had been left, intentionally. Ruth moved deeper inside. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of a shelf. No dust. Or very little. Not what it should have been. Not after all these years. She turned slowly, taking it in. The quiet. The order. The care. Her mother hadn't locked this place to keep things out. She had locked it to keep something in. Ruth's attention shifted to the far wall. A cabinet. Metal. Low to the ground. Set apart from everything else. It wasn't large, but it didn't match the rest of the space. The wood around it had aged. The cabinet hadn't. Not in the same way. Ruth walked toward it. Her steps slow, measured. She stopped just short. The surface was cool when she touched it, smooth. No rust, or very little. There was a lock, different from the one on the door, smaller, more precise. Ruth crouched slightly, leaning closer. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the metal. For a second, she hesitated. Then she reached into her pocket. The key. It felt heavier now. She held it up. Compared the size. It fit. Not perfectly, but close enough. Ruth exhaled quietly, then slid the key into the lock. This time there was no resistance. It turned easily. A soft click. Ruth rested her hand on the handle, paused, then opened it. Inside, not tools, not keepsakes. Paper. Stacks of it, neatly arranged, bound in groups, some tied with string, some clipped together, all labeled. Ruth stared at them. Didn't move at first. Then she reached in and pulled one bundle free. The paper felt firm, well kept. She untied the string. Carefully. The top sheet slid free, typed, official. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Land record. Her breath caught slightly. She flipped to the next page. Tax receipt. Another agreement. Ruth sat down, right there on the floor, the wood cool beneath her. She spread the papers in front of her, one by one. Dates, names, signatures. The pattern didn't appear immediately, but she stayed with it. Read each line, compared each document. Her eyes moved back and forth, matching one to the next. Something was there. Something consistent. Her fingers paused on a name. Leonard Delaney. She frowned slightly. Turned to another page. The same name. Another document. Again. Repeated. Across years. Ruth's heartbeat shifted. Not faster. Just different. She kept going. More pages, more dates. Each one connected. Each one part of something larger. And always, the same structure. The same role. She leaned back slightly, looked at the papers spread around her, then down again. More carefully this time. Not just reading. Understanding. Leonard's name wasn't listed as owner. Not once. It appeared again and again under a different heading. Tenant. Ruth went still. The word sat there, clear, undeniable. She blinked, looked at another document, then another. The same. Always the same. Her hand moved slowly to the next page, then the next. The years stretched back. Decades. 40 of them. All tied together. All documented. All signed. Ruth sat there in the quiet of the shed, the light shifting slightly through the cracks in the wood. Her mind moved carefully, piece by piece, memory lining up against paper. The house, the land. The way Leonard had handled everything. The cabinet he kept closed. The answers he gave without being asked. I've got it covered. Ruth looked down at the documents again, then around the room. Everything here had been kept, maintained, protected. Her mother's handwriting on every label, every box, every bundle. Nothing left to chance. Nothing left loose. This wasn't storage. This was record. Ruth's hands rested on the papers, still, her breathing slow, steady. The kind of stillness that comes when something begins to make sense, not all at once, but enough. Enough to change the shape of what you thought you knew. She reached for another bundle, untied it, and kept reading. The next bundle was thicker. The paper inside felt older, edges softened with time, corners slightly curled. Ruth laid the first page flat against the floor, pressing it gently so it wouldn't roll back. Her eyes moved slower now, not scanning, studying. The heading was different this time. Trust agreement. Ruth frowned slightly. She read the line again, then again. Her mother's name appeared first. Not handwritten this time, typed, formal. Listed clearly as the original holder of the land. Ruth leaned closer. The light shifted as a cloud passed overhead, dimming the room just enough that she had to tilt the page to see better. Her fingers traced the lines as she read. The language was precise, legal, but not impossible. Not if you took your time. And Ruth had always taken her time. She followed each paragraph carefully. The property description, the boundaries, the acreage. It matched the land outside. Not just the small patch where the house had stood, but everything around it. The field, the tree line, the space she had walked through just minutes ago. All of it. Held under one name, her mother's. Ruth's breath came a little slower. She turned the page. There were amendments. Updates made over the years, each one signed, each one witnessed, each one adding something small. Clarifying, strengthening. Her mother hadn't just owned the land, she had structured it, protected it. Ruth kept reading, then she saw it. A later amendment. Dated years after Ruth had married Leonard. Her name, Ruth Delaney. Listed clearly. Not as a note, not as an afterthought. As the successor, the sole beneficiary. Ruth sat back slightly. The paper remained in her hands. She didn't blink, didn't move. The words stayed where they were, unchanging. She read the line again, then again. The same, always the same. Ruth's eyes drifted back to the earlier documents spread around her. The lease agreements, the tax receipts saw. Leonard's name, always present, always consistent, but never where she had assumed it would be. She leaned forward again, pulled one of the lease documents closer, compared the dates, the signatures, then back to the trust. The connection formed slowly. Not sudden, not dramatic. Just undeniable. Leonard hadn't owned the house. Not once. He had been paying for the right to live there. Year after year, to her mother. Ruth's hand rested on the page. Still. Her mind moved through the years, the mornings, the dinners, the quiet conversations across the table, the decisions he made without asking, the papers he kept out of reach. I've got it covered. She had believed him, because there had never been a reason not to. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, not to shut it out, just to steady the pieces as they shifted. When she opened them again, the room felt sharper, clearer. The past didn't blur anymore. It aligned. Each memory finding its place against what she now knew. She reached for another document. The final lease in the stack. The date stood out immediately. The year her mother had passed. Ruth read it carefully, then flipped to the next. There wasn't one. No continuation, no renewal. The payments had stopped. The agreement had ended. But the ownership had never changed. Ruth looked back at the trust papers. At her name, at the structure her mother had put in place. It hadn't dissolved. It hadn't transferred. It had waited, untouched, unclaimed, but still there, still intact. Ruth exhaled slowly. The sound barely filled the space. Her eyes moved around the shed again. The shelves, the labels, the careful order of everything. Her mother had known. Not just about the land, but about the future. About what might happen. She hadn't left this hidden by accident. She had placed it here, protected it, made sure it would last. Long enough. Ruth's gaze dropped back to the papers. Her hands rested flat against the floor now, grounding her. For a moment, she thought about the house. The one she had just been asked to leave. The one already being measured. Listed, discussed, not as her home, but as property. Ruth let that settle, not as anger, not yet, as understanding. Cold, clear. Leonard had known. That part came without hesitation. There was no other way. The leases were signed, year after year. He had seen the documents, read them, agreed to them, and never said a word. Not once. Ruth sat there in the quiet. The wind outside moved softly against the walls. A low sound. Steady. Time passed. She didn't measure it. Didn't need to. When she finally moved, it was slow. Deliberate. She gathered the papers carefully. Not rushed, not careless. Each bundle placed back in order. Each page aligned. Exactly as she had found it. Except now she knew what they were, what they meant. Ruth closed the cabinet gently. The latch clicked into place. The same quiet sound, but it didn't feel the same anymore. She stood. Looked around the shed one more time. Everything still where it had been. Nothing changed. Except her. She walked to the door, paused there, her hand resting against the wood. The outside light brighter now. Afternoon settling in. Ruth stepped out. The air felt different. Not warmer, not colder, just wider. She turned back once, looked at the shed, the place that had held everything together without her knowing. Then she reached out and pulled the door closed behind her. The lock hung loose now, unlatched, unused. Ruth didn't put it back. She didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to stay closed. Not anymore. Ruth didn't rush back to the car. She stood there a moment longer, the wind moving lightly across the field, pressing the grass in slow waves. The shed behind her creaked faintly as it settled back into place. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Ruth walked across the uneven ground, her steps steady now, more certain than when she had arrived. The path back to the car didn't seem as unfamiliar. The turns, the distance, it all felt clearer, as if something had been adjusted inside her. She opened the car door and paused. Her hand rested on the frame. The papers were still inside the shed. She hadn't taken them. Not yet. That thought lingered, then passed. Ruth got in, closed the door, and started the engine. The drive back felt shorter, not because the road had changed, but because she had. By the time she reached town, the light had begun to shift toward evening. Long shadows stretched across the streets, settling into corners and along the edges of buildings. Ruth parked outside the hardware store and stepped out. The door below opened and closed as customers moved in and out. The smell of metal and sawdust drifted upward. Normal. Routine. But when she reached the top of the stairs and unlocked her door, something stopped her. It wasn't the sound. It wasn't the light. It was the way the room felt. Subtle, but different. Ruth stepped inside slowly. The window was open. She hadn't left it that way. The curtain moved slightly in the breeze. The air carried a faint chill. Ruth set her purse down on the table and looked around. Nothing was overturned, nothing broken. Everything looked mostly the same, but her eyes moved carefully now, noticing. The drawer she had closed that morning, slightly open. The edge of her folded sweater shifted just enough that it no longer lined up with the others. Ruth walked to the dresser, opened the drawer fully. Her things were still there, but not arranged the way she had left them. Someone had looked, not taken, just checked. Ruth closed the drawer. Her hand lingered there for a moment. Then she turned. There was a knock at the door, sharp, measured. Ruth didn't move right away. The knock came again. Ruth? Daniel's voice. She walked to the door and opened it. He stood there in the hallway, the same coat, the same controlled posture, but something in his expression had changed. Less polite. More urgent. "We need to talk," he said. Ruth stepped aside. He walked in, glancing around quickly, his eyes moving over the room in a way that told her he had already been there. "You went out to the property," he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth closed the door behind him. "Yes," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. His jaw tightened just slightly. "You should have told me," he said. Ruth didn't answer that. She watched him instead. Waited. "There are things you don't understand," he continued. "That land, those records, it's complicated. Legal structures, filings, obligations. It's not something you should be trying to sort through on your own." Ruth's gaze didn't shift. "I've been sorting things out on my own for a while now," she said. Daniel exhaled quietly. This time he did look at her directly. "We're trying to make this easier," he said. "For you, easier." The word didn't land. Ruth thought about the shed, the papers, the signatures, the years laid out clearly across every page. There had been nothing unclear about them. "You've already listed the house, Phil," she said. Daniel hesitated. "Preliminary discussions," he replied. "Nothing finalized." Ruth tilted her head slightly. "People were measuring the rooms," she said. Daniel didn't respond. The silence stretched. Then he shifted, reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. "I came to give you this." Ruth took it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Official. She didn't open it right away. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel paused, then answered. "Just a formal notice," he said. "Standard procedure." Ruth looked at him. Waited. "It's about guardianship," he added. "Temporary. Just until everything is sorted out." The word settled. Guardianship. Ruth opened the envelope. Inside were several pages, typed, stamped. Her name appeared near the top. Evelyn Ruth Delaney, age 67. The words beneath it came slowly. Assessment, capacity, oversight. Ruth read each line carefully. Didn't rush, didn't skip. Her fingers held the pages steady. When she finished, she lowered them slightly, looked up. You think I can't manage my own affairs, she said. Daniel shook his head quickly. It's not like that, he said. It's just, given the situation, your living arrangements, the complexity of the estate, it's a precaution, that's all. A precaution. Ruth thought about the shed again. The order, the clarity, the way everything had been laid out, waiting. There had been nothing uncertain about it, nothing that required someone else to interpret it for her. I'm not signing anything, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Daniel's expression shifted again. Less controlled now, more direct. You don't have to sign, he said. It can move forward without that. Ruth held his gaze. The space between them felt different now, not uncertain. Defined. You've already been through my things, she said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. You've already started taking the house apart, she continued. And now you're telling me I can't understand what belongs to me. Daniel stepped back slightly. That's not what this is about, he said. Ruth folded the papers carefully, placed them back in the envelope, set it on the table. Then she walked past him. To the window. Looked out at the street below. The same delivery truck from earlier was gone. A different one had taken its place. Life moving forward, without asking, without waiting. Ruth rested her hand lightly on the edge of the sill. Then she turned back. I'm going out again tomorrow, she said. Daniel frowned. Where? He asked. Ruth met his eyes. To the place you told me not to worry about. The words settled between them. Clear. Unchanged. Daniel didn't speak right away. Then he nodded once. Slow. As if adjusting to something he hadn't expected. You should be careful, he said. Ruth didn't respond. He moved toward the door, paused, then left. The hallway outside fell quiet again. Ruth stood where she was. The envelope still on the table. The room still slightly disturbed, but something inside her that wasn't disturbed anymore. She walked back to the table, picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, then set it aside. Not hidden, not discarded, just placed. Ruth reached for her purse. The key was still inside, waiting. Tomorrow she would go back. Not to look, not to wonder, but to understand. And this time, she would take everything with her. Ruth stepped back into the shed with a different kind of stillness. Not the kind that waits, the kind that knows. She didn't rush to the cabinet, didn't go straight for the papers. Instead, she stood in the middle of the room and looked at it the way her mother must have, quietly, completely, like every detail mattered. The shelves, the labels, the care. Her mother hadn't hidden this because it was complicated. She had hidden it because Ruth had never been taught to look. That was the part that settled in now. Not the betrayal, not even Leonard, but how easily she had accepted not knowing. Ruth knelt again, gathered the documents, this time stacking them in her arms. The weight surprised her. Not heavy, just real. Outside, the wind moved across the field, the same way it always had. Nothing out there had changed. Only what she could see. She closed the shed door behind her, not locking it this time. Didn't need to. As she walked back toward the car, the ground felt different under her feet. Familiar, but no longer borrowed. She paused once, turning back. Not to check. Just to look. 40 years in one house, and the truth had never been in it. It had been waiting out here the whole time. Ruth opened the car door, set the papers carefully on the seat, and sat down. For a moment, she didn't start the engine. She just sat there, thinking about all the things she had never asked, and all the answers that had been there anyway. Then she reached for the key, turned it in the ignition, and drove forward. Slow, steady, like someone who finally knew where she was going. If you had lived your whole life believing something was yours, would you know the moment you realized it actually was?